Mm-hmm.
And you have, for example, the worship of the sun, the darkness, the dead end, the presence of the Nile and what its position was in the economy. Every one of the gods that they had that are represented, they would have been gods they worshiped. And this god, like the Baal god, that whenever Elijah had 7 years of famine, and Baal was the fertility god that makes you have prosperity. The point is, God is supreme over all of the Egyptian gods.
Yeah. Would you say also the 10th plague culminates in that against Pharaoh himself, considered a god, and the striking of his firstborn? Maybe that fits in the pattern too. Rita, do you have a thought?
Just something that I had evidently just kind of read over before that I noticed this time was that in chapter 10, when he tells Moses again to go into Pharaoh, and in verse 2 he says that he's talking about his signs, that you may tell in the hearing of your son and your son's son the mighty things I have done in Egypt, and my signs which I have done among them, so that you may know that I am the Lord. And so it never really hit me before that this wasn't just for Pharaoh's benefit and the Egyptians' benefit, but it was also for Moses and the Israelites, or the Hebrews. And then it made me think of later when they're taking the land and the fear of the people, because all those many years later they had heard about the plagues and what God had done. And so evidently, the Hebrews were able to spread that word. I'd never really caught that before.
I'm going to come back to that. The peoples heard that later, because that actually makes a super neat reference later in the Old Testament. But you have that reference, like you said, in 10 and 1 and 2, where the Israelites would know that Yahweh is God. But if you back up into chapter 9, and I have this later in the notes, but I'll address it now. God makes the point in verse 15, by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. God is essentially saying, if I wanted to, this would already be over. But that's not his purpose. If his purpose was solely to destroy Pharaoh, he could have just done it, and it would have been over, like Sodom and Gomorrah, just done. But he goes on. But for this purpose I've raised you up, to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. So not even just locally to the Israelites or just to the Egyptians, but everybody is going to hear about this, and it's going to prove who God is. Something else I noticed just going through, I don't know that you could do anything with this, but I thought it interesting. And this is what you do in observation time. You find stuff and you go, well, I don't know if it's useful, but I'm gonna notice it. The first 3 plagues mention Aaron. It's Aaron that stretches out his staff. It's Moses that tells Aaron to do a thing, and then the thing happens. Plagues 4 and 5, no reference to that. It just says God did whatever the thing was, right? God brought the death of the livestock in the 5th one. When you come back to plagues 6 through 9, now Moses is the one doing the things. Moses is the one who throws the soot in the air in the 6th plague. Moses stretches out his staff. Moses stretches his hand toward heaven. Of course, instructed by God, but Moses is kind of the key guy there. But then in plague number 10, it comes back to God, right? Just as it did with the plague of the death of livestock, the death of the firstborn is attributed to God. Other people have broken up the plagues different ways. Some of them, I don't know that they're useful. I did notice that in the 5th and the 10th plague, when it came time to take life directly, God did it himself. When the livestock are going to die, God does that. When the firstborn are going to die, God does that. This was what I mentioned a moment ago, that if the plagues were to destroy Egypt, he could have just done that already. But they were to demonstrate something about himself. We talked about the repeated references. Okay, sometimes when you study the Bible, 3 things happen. You are reinforced in the thing that you knew, you learn something new, or you learn that the thing you knew was wrong. Right? Those are kind of your 3 basics. All 3 of them happened on this chart for me. Right? Let me explain what I mean. I said at one point that when it talks about who hardened whose heart in these chapters, I said just kind of categorically that the first 5 plagues, it either says that someone did it or that Pharaoh did it, And then in plagues 6 through 10, it says that God did all of those. That's not quite accurate, all right? It's close, but it's not quite there. Because you'll notice in the 7th one, it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. And then in the 8th one, it comes back to I have, and then the Lord, and then the Lord. So it's not just 5 and 5. You get a little bit of a mixture there. So that was the part I learned that was actually inaccurate. The thing that I learned that I didn't know before, the Hebrew uses 2 different words for hardened in the section. One of the words is related to the word for glory. That's KBD there at the end. To be weighty, to be heavy, to be honored, or to be glorified is kind of the idea there. Both words get used. The first one, the one there highlighted in the green, means to grow or to make strong or to seize or to grasp something. There's an interesting reference. You remember when God tells God tells Moses to throw his staff down and it becomes a serpent? And Moses runs from it, you remember, on the mountain? And then he says, go and take the snake up again. And the text says that Moses went and he grasped the snake by the tail. It's the same word. It's the same word as what you see there in the green, to make strong or to prevail or to seize. It's one of those things that doesn't show up in English, but when you look at the original language, it does, right? There are 2 different ways of talking about what happened with Pharaoh's heart. We talked about this, I think, a lot last week, as a who did it. Was it God or was it Pharaoh? And I think the answer is yes, right? The free will of the matter wasn't removed, nor was it removed the idea that God could set up by providence the situation he wanted and have it go the way he wanted, right? Both of those can exist at the same time. So anyway, just something neat to kind of talk about. Let's think about the original readers, okay? Maybe the generation in the wilderness who would have heard this for the first time. We can think about Israel being an original reader of this. What would they have done with it, right? We always try to think about what would they have done with it before we think about what we would have done with it. It helps us take the right points, all right? So you're hearing this story. As even Rita brought up, the point of this was so that their sons and their grandsons would hear this, right? So what lessons would be available to those sons and grandsons, right? What would they have learned from thinking through, reading through the section, hearing it read to them? What do you think? Yeah.
Well, to me, to a certain extent, their worship of God probably had gotten watered down, so it reinforced, when they heard the stories, it reinforced who God was, and to a group of people who may or may not have continued to worship God like they were supposed to, or that's what I get from it. That's what I would get from it. Okay, now I know who he is for sure, and I know what his power is.
So maybe it reinforced their understanding of who God was, which would then lead to being careful as to how you worship and how you treat him and things like that, okay? Yeah?
And it also showed that the gods that Egypt worshipped were not like Yahweh.
No. They were not valid. They were not powerful. They were not any such thing. There's a line in 1 Samuel that I read recently that I thought was so entertaining. The Philistines had victory in battle, and it says that they had to go and tell their gods what had happened. And it just, why would you need to do that? Because they're not real. But that wouldn't make sense if it were a legitimate God who had some power and ability, right? They had to go tell their gods they had won. Wow. Yes?
It kind of sit with me that when you see these plagues and then you think about the intensity, we always think of Moses and the Red Sea, right?
Mm-hmm.
How that was an incredible miracle.
Mm-hmm.
This is what leads up to help me believe in that miracle, so to speak. This is the building blocks to see God work this way with the most powerful man on earth, with all of their God, but nothing can stop him, nothing can overpower the God that we serve, right? We're interpreting this to our sons and grandsons.
Right.
And then we're going to tell them the story of how we escaped. And this is kind of like the precursor to see all of those things, how neat that progression is.
The Exodus story would involve God being in control of the water and the weather and whether or not people lived or cattle lived, and meteorological events and things they'd never seen. Just all of these forces that are so much bigger than our ability to control, and God just wields them as he wants to. That would have been a hugely important lesson. Yes, and then you're next.
Yeah, I think, like we talked about, 15 and 16 and 9 already, it says plainly, could have done away with all of this, but I'm doing this to show you my power and my capabilities.
Yep.
It's kind of a staple of that, wow, yeah, there's a lot of power and a lot of capability here.
Yeah, and standing opposite that is a real mistake. Yes.
I was just thinking of Jesus calming the Sea of Galilee
Mhm.
for his apostles.
Mm-hmm.
So, same idea of control over the elements, what God was able to do here and
Yep.
what he did in that situation.
Yep. It helps us identify who Jesus is, that he can do the same sorts of things that God does during the Exodus. One big separation, and I took this from the seventh plague and the different responses to God's word, right? There were Egyptians in chapter 9 and verse 20. Whoever feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh hurried his slaves and his livestock into the houses. But whoever did not pay attention to the word of the Lord left his slaves and his livestock in the field. That's a clean look. You got two different kinds of people. You have the people who feared the word of Yahweh, feared the word of the Lord, and they were saved. Their livestock survived. And then you've got the ones who decided, I don't think so. And all of theirs died. That's a very plain black and white lesson. The people who listen to God are the ones who live and are blessed, are able to continue. And those who don't. Right? Very left hand, right hand kind of teaching. Yep.
Just thought it was interesting, Pharaoh had to go look and see that Israel's animals were okay.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't.
Yeah, you can almost sense like, okay, he's gotten a report about it, and it seems too good to be true, or too bad to be true, and has to go investigate himself. I don't take much from this particular commentary, but I did like this line. He said that Yahweh fights, quote, with weapons that no one but he has at his disposal, and that only he can command. After all, what defense is there against the forces of creation itself? You start thinking about the things God did in Genesis 1, right? What was the very first one? Let there be light. The God that can say, let there be light, can also say, let there be none of it. For 3 days. I don't know. It wasn't a solar eclipse that happened that day. It was, there is no light anywhere. And you could imagine in 3 days' time, they've tried to light all the torches. They've scurried around and fumbled around to try to find all the flints to make fire. They have tried everything, right? In the first hour, you might say. All the things God can do in creation, he can also wield as he wills, right? The God that made the animals to live can also make them to die. The God that brought forth man can undo that, right? All those different things. It shows that God is truly different. Yes, sir.
In that darkness, Israel still had light.
Yeah, they did.
You could see all darkness, but you imagine what that said to the people.
What would it have looked like on the Israelite side of the line? Right? Was it like a curtain? Or it makes you wonder, right? Like, what did it look? What did it look like? I don't know. One of those things. Big lesson, I think. Whatever you do, don't do like Pharaoh. Right? That's a big lesson when you study characters who make mistakes in the Bible. Is don't do the thing they did. Here's the really neat connection I wanted to make, and this is back to our point earlier about the nations finding out what happened. Leave your marker there, but go to 1 Samuel 6. All right, 1 Samuel 6, obviously things aren't going well in Israel, right? The ark has been captured. It has been in the land of the Philistines for 7 months, and you remember that terrible things happened there, right? They kept moving it from city to city, thinking, well, maybe it's the city, and it wasn't. Everywhere it went, terrible things happened. They're making this plan to send it back, right, to Israel. Look at verse 6. Or rather, let's begin in verse 5. It says, so you must make images of your tumors and images of your mice that ravage the land and give glory to the God of Israel. That's, whatever. Lost my place. Perhaps he will lighten his hand from off you and your gods in your land. Now look at verse 6. Why should you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? after he had dealt severely with them, did they not send the people away and they departed? Even the Philistines know the story. The Philistines know, oh, well, here's what happened. When they tangled with this Yahweh, I mean, it really went badly for them. And even after their trial, they sent the people away, right? And I guess they took from that God stopped destroying them when the people left, which is kind of true, if you don't count the Red Sea thing, right? God stopped the plagues when the people left. And the Philistines were like, look, don't do that, right? Let's just quit. We can't win this. Let's stop resisting this. It's one of those moments where the Gentiles got it and the Israelites didn't, right? I mean, I just thought it a fascinating reference that they would know and the Israelites didn't. Back in Exodus, in 9 and verse 17, who does it say that Pharaoh was exalting himself against? I thought this was an interesting reference in Exodus 9 and verse 17.
More people.
Wouldn't you expect to say you're exalting yourself against me or against God? And that would have certainly been true. But God says you are exalting yourself against my people. So Pharaoh, who would have thought himself leader over all these Israelites, and they are just the lowly slaves, and God's like, you're trying to lift yourself up against them. God had a very different estimation of Israel than Pharaoh did, right? And it's that idea that, if you exalt yourself against God or his people, you are going to be humbled, right? Remember the promises that were made to the patriarchs, especially to Abraham? The one who blesses you I will bless, and the one who curses you I will curse, right? A people that are connected with God are going to be protected by God. And your relationship with them affects your well-being, not just with God, but with his people. If you raise yourself up against God's people, it's not going to go well. God's on their side. Another thing, too, you can take out of the plagues specifically is that when men rebel against God, the earth or the world or everything suffers because of that, right? The earth didn't enter its period of suffering until Genesis 3, right? There wasn't the curse against the ground. There weren't the thorns, that kind of thing. When man sinned, everything got worse after that. Many of these plagues were judgments of the Egyptian gods, but the land itself of Egypt suffered. And by the time the plagues are over, there are no green things. There's nothing growing. There's no livestock. There's no nothing, right? It's, in essence, it's the famine that was warned to the previous Pharaoh by Jacob, but it's been made a reality. They have nothing. There's a reason why the Egyptians said, don't you see that the land is ruined? It is not good. Certainly not something that if you were an Egyptian historian or a carver, making the hieroglyphs and such, you wouldn't have wanted to written a chapter about that. Right? You don't write a whole chapter on the side of a pyramid about how terrible we were over this period of time. You kind of just, let's just forget that, right? That could be something for it. The idea that sin results in the land suffering is repeated in the covenant curses too, against Israel, right? There would be no land. The sky would become bronze, kind of an image there. Not just Israel, but the land of Israel would suffer because of their faithlessness. So God ties those two things together. Okay, let's think about us, right? Us here and now today. We've heard a couple of applications already, but how do we take what we've read here and make connections or applications to life today, right? So not so much about them, but more about us. What do we do with this? It's a good time to repeat that this isn't the little kid's Bible class story. This is just a Bible story. We need to be able to take applications for the adults too, right? What would you do with this?
Well, 10 verse 28, a good line in there about where Moses trying to compromise, and Moses tells him there will not be a hoof left behind. Right? I've heard sermons named that, titled that. But it's just the whole idea. There is no compromise. And the other side of that also is whatever God sets to do, he does completely. There is no
nothing left behind. It is done to a complete fashion.
Israel's commitment to God, at least expressed by Moses, would be complete, total. Not halfway or partials, or we're going to go surf for a while and we'll be back. It was to be a complete, leave and cleave type situation, right? They weren't getting married, but that's the idea. Did you have a thought?
I zeroed in on the heart of his heart, and the way in which God hardened his heart was not miraculous. He gave him commandments to obey and evidence to support what he told him to do, and he refused to do it. And in that process, your heart becomes hardened to God.
Yes.
And so you can have Pharaoh harden his heart, and then ourselves, and God hardening our heart through this process. That still happens to people today. The first time you hear the gospel and you know you ought to obey it, you might be tender, but you can get to where you can go through an invitation without your heart even being touched. You're saying, "Hey, we need to hurry and get home so I can watch the ball game."
Yeah. What happens to you when you repeat the same sinful decision? It gets easier and easier and easier, right? You become more and more callous to that. I put a couple verses up on that subject, but I think Hebrews 3 is the one that I think of. Take care, and then the end of verse 13, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Deceitfulness as in trickery, lying, deception. You think it's going to be okay and it's not. It's fooling you, right? I'm sure Pharaoh thought at some point, well, Moses is just going to give up, and this is all going to kind of blow over, and it didn't, right? Whatever form of logic went through his head was not valid, right? And it just kept going. Yes, and then you're next.
I wrote a note just in my Bible. Some will listen and trust God's word, and some will test his word. And that just kind of what I saw as a recurring theme of, we talked about, for all the animals, you were explicitly told that Mike was teeing off on it there, like, you have the opportunity, here's what you've been told, it's your decision, and there will be people in this, whether it's people at church or people we try to talk to, whatever, that will hear it, and they'll say, yep, I'm gonna do what I wanna do, and I'm gonna test it, and they'll, see the consequences of
Yeah.
those actions, and some people go, okay, I'm gonna do what I'm told.
That's what makes the seventh and eighth plague just fascinating. Is in the seventh one you have Egyptians who did hear it and thought, maybe we better give it a try, right? We've been through a lot. Okay, have you seen the frogs? Right? Well, I brought that up last week. We're going to give it a go, and it worked out, right? And then in the eighth one, they're incredulous that Pharaoh continues to refuse, but he does, right? There's the contrast there in Proverbs 28:14 between the one who fears the Lord and the one who hardens his heart. And you have both of those present in our story, right? There are those who fear God, and then there are those who refuse to do that. Kimberly, do you have a thought?
I was just going to add off of this point that Pharaoh waiting until the 10th plague, it did not get better for him. Things got worse. I feel like it's something that we see a lot in the world, that by the time we got to the 10th plague, his son died before he finally, got really mad and said, okay, I'm done.
Yeah.
Things don't get better when you keep making the same decision.
Yeah. He gave up everything to defend his choice. Everything, right? You can't give up more than your child. He gave up everything to try to make this go the other way, and that's not how this works, right? You're not dealing with a person. Yes, and then you're next.
The idea of God making a distinction, I see that application for us today as well. It's not a miraculous distinction, but when he's given us a way to run our lives according to his will, the consequences that come to the world for chasing your passion in sin, we don't bear. And part of that, your life is different, visibility to the world is what draws people to the gospel. God made a distinction. I'm telling you the best way to live the best life. And because of that, you'll be noticed, and that will bring glory to me when you bring them to Christ.
Yeah. That they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven, right? Jesus said that, Matthew 5. Talking about the distinction between people, I thought about God's people dwelling in light and everyone else dwelling in darkness. That's 1 John, right? You walk in the light as he is in the light. We have fellowship with each other. Jesus' blood cleanses us from our sin. God is light, in him's no darkness. If we're with him, we're not in the darkness, right? God's people were with him. They were on his side in the plagues, in the 9th plague. The Egyptians were not, and they were in abject, total, complete, unfathomable darkness. There's, again, your distinction between those two groups of people. Ryan?
One of the applications I find is that this is the same God that we serve.
Absolutely it is.
Sometimes it's hard. Like, we read this as almost a story sometimes, but we lose the aspect of the same God that saved his people then made that same provisions for me right now, right? By sending Jesus to save me. That was my passage. Those were my plagues, that he took care of me and took me out of that same land, right, of sin. And it made me think of Matthew 10:28. It says, do not be afraid of those who kill the body and cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. And just understanding that power that God has. We don't see it manifest necessarily the same way now. But I don't need to, because I believe what he did back then, we can still do now if he chose.
Yeah, I heard it said one time that our conception of God will never be big enough, right? And this helps us kind of push that border out a bit to think he really is beyond, right? As Paul put it, all that we can ask or think, Think about this too. The person who lifts himself up against God gets humiliated. And we could also say the person that lifts himself up against God's people gets humiliated. Right? The one who refuses to be humble, the one who, decides to be partial, right, against their brother, the one who decides not to be humble, to be the servant of all, the way Jesus taught, that person doesn't make it. Right? The greatest among you, Jesus said, will be your servant. He said that plainly. The one who lifts himself up against God or even against God's people, that person gets the Pharaoh treatment. And they lose everything. Right? That's, again, a repeated lesson and something that's taught all throughout the New Testament.
Hey, Kyle?
Yep.
One of the applications that we need to be careful about is sometimes our stubbornness doesn't just hurt us. It hurts a whole lot of other people. And if you stop and think about it, probably a tenth of the population in Egypt died. And probably about that, everything they owned was wiped out. And any money and jewelry that they had, they gave away because they were so anxious. Our decisions don't just harm us, they harm other people too.
Yeah, there's a great amount of collateral damage in our sinfulness. And the more people we have authority or power over, the worse it is. Right? It only magnifies that effect. Yes?
We go way back to the beginning of all of this in Exodus 5. The first response of Pharaoh was interesting to me. Exodus 5:2. Pharaoh says, who is the Lord that I shall obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. And by the end of the 10th plague, both of those had come to pass. He understood through the 10 plagues who God was, and he let Israel go.
And we made this point last week too. God gave Pharaoh 2 chances before the first plague, right? There's this initial call, and then there's the one after the serpent been turned, the staff to a serpent. Before anything happened on the grand scale that it did, he had opportunities, which again reveals his character. One more time. Think about Moses in all of this, right? Moses has to continually go back and forth before Pharaoh. He and Aaron, of course, working together, but he's sort of the face of this whole thing. If you can imagine it from Moses' perspective, right? Going to Pharaoh repeatedly, telling him, Pharaoh giving him the runaround, and begging to him, you might say on bended knee to get the plagues to stop, and maybe there's that little whisper of, he might just get it this time, and then again and again he didn't. Interesting word choice in 8 and verse 29. He tells Pharaoh, don't cheat again. It's the same word Jacob used when he spoke to Laban. Remember when Laban was cheating him out of his wages? It's the same word, right? Quit cheating this situation. And Pharaoh didn't. And Pharaoh, of course, refused. It kind of reminds you of the situation Ezekiel was put into, right? Where he would have to be more stubborn than the stubborn Israelites to continue to preach the message to the exiles. Just a connection to that. And then in chapter 11, I thought this interesting too. Moses wasn't indifferent about all of this, right? At the end of what he's saying, he describes going out in hot anger. This wasn't, Moses rubbing his hands together gleefully saying, well, they're going to get it now, right? Moses is talking to his family, the people he grew up with, or at least related to the people he grew up with, right? And you might say that might have affected him more than anybody, because he's talking to people that are related to the people who raised him in probably very nearly the places where he was raised, He's going home to preach that message. And they wouldn't do anything about it, to the point where God's going to destroy the firstborn. It's no wonder he leaves in hot anger the way he does, right? You forget that sometimes. Okay, last thing we always try to do, and if we haven't done it already, we want to make sure we do it explicitly, is find where this connects to Jesus, right? The entire Old Testament, somewhere or another, points forward to Christ. Either, it just depends. Here's a couple of those. In the plagues of Egypt, what preceded the death of the firstborn was darkness. And the same thing happened on the cross, right? From the 6th hour to the 9th hour, Matthew 27 tells us there was darkness over all the land. Just as Pharaoh's firstborn was preceded by darkness, so was God's, right? So we get just a sense of just how wrong, how backwards this is what was happening in that scene. I put Pilate, that's supposed to be Pharaoh, I'm sorry. Pilate wasn't around in Exodus, so we'll have to fix that. Pilate did a little better than Pharaoh. But just as God used Pharaoh's refusal of his will to save Israel, God used the refusal of Israel to save Jesus. You think about that, right? God used Israel's hardness of heart and their refusal and their rebellion to then bring about salvation through Jesus. I don't have time to get into Romans 9 to 11, but that's one of the points that I think is made strongly in that section. And then one author made the point, and I didn't think he was correct. He made the point that nowhere else in Scripture did God specify when he would do a thing and then did the thing. I'm like, I can give you some examples. That aside, it does connect to the idea of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Because didn't Jesus give a specific timeline as to when it would happen? He says, I will be crucified, and then he says repeatedly, on the third day be raised, right? Destroy this temple, and I will build it in 3 days, right? Jesus repeatedly gave a timestamp as to when he would be raised from the dead. Just like God says in the plagues, I will do this tomorrow, and then the thing happens. One more, the distinction between Israel and Egypt, it prefigures what Jesus will do in judgment with all of mankind, right? Matthew 25 describes all of mankind being separated as sheep from goats, right? The right hand and the left hand. The distinction made in Exodus between God's people and not God's people will be made again by Christ, right? One more.
I think both the plague and the resurrection of Christ, God used death to be glorified. God was glorified.
That is a good one. Man, that's a good one. You're right. I need to write that one down. That's why I like Bible class, because someone says something. Yeah.
Also worth noting that the darkness lasted 3 days.
There it does. 3 days, 3 hours, right? And then the time in the tomb. So it works for that too.
3 days of darkness.
Awesome. Okay, next week, the 28th, the first, I don't remember if there's 28 verses in chapter 12, but just that section, okay? Don't be alarmed that it's not enormous. I wanted to spend one lesson on this specifically, right? And we'll make up the time later. But it's Exodus 12 down to verse 28, all right? That'll be next week. And it's all of lesson 4, so we won't split that one apart.